Welcome to Capacity Building Stories Climate Action 101, a podcast brought to you by the Paris Commune on Capacity Buildings Network in partnership with the United Nations University. I'm Eva Costas, your host, and in this series, we're breaking down the essentials of climate action, 101 style. Join us as we explore key concepts related to climate change while connecting the dots between capacity building, research, policy, and practical solutions. Let's dive in. Welcome to Nature-Based Solutions 101. Today's episode is all about nature-based solutions, what they mean in the context of climate change, where the biggest capacity gaps lie, and what's being done to address those gaps. Now, joining us today are two wonderful experts, Liane Roper and Simone Sandholz. Could the two of you please introduce yourselves to our listeners?
Hello, everyone. My name is Liane Roper. I am a Program Management Officer with the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, or UNDRR, the Bonn office. Very nice to be here.
And thanks for the invitation from my side as well. I'm Simone Sandholz. I'm leading an academic division with UN University's Institute for Environment and Human Security, and I'm also co-leading a group on eco-disaster risk reduction with IUCN. So excited to talk about the topic later.
Wonderful. Welcome both, and thank you so much for joining us. Now let's dive right into the topic. And Liane, nature-based solutions is a term that we've heard before, but for some of us, it can feel more like a buzzword. So could you explain what we actually mean by nature-based solutions in climate change and why they're such a critical part of climate action today?
Thank you for that question, Eva. Perhaps to start by speaking a little to nature-based solutions in the context of climate change. When we think about climate change, it's a pervasive disruptor. And what that means is all areas of life in one way or another, directly or indirectly, are affected by climate change. And it drives changes in nature due to temperature shifts or changes in rainfall patterns, etc. Then when we think about nature, it's really a necessary part of life. Life doesn't happen without nature. We're talking about how nature contributes to our lives through material provisions, which could be water or food. It could be how it regulates the climate or the water cycle, importantly as well, how it reduces disaster impact and risk, or those non-material elements relating to culture, health and well-being, recreation, etc. So then when we talk about nature-based solutions, it's looking at part of the climate action that captures these solutions to ensure that there is resilience, but also contributing to sustainable development in a holistic way. When we consider the UNEA definition, or it's the actions to protect, conserve, restore, sustainably use, and manage natural resources, and these could be terrestrial, freshwater, coastal, or marine ecosystems, and to address the social, economic, and environmental challenges that we have in an effective and an adaptive way, but simultaneously providing human well-being, ecosystem services, resilience, and biodiversity benefits. When we therefore think about the question that you asked, two reasons I would say it's important. One is to derive benefits from nature in a sustained manner, despite the stresses from climate change. And the second is to make nature a central part of our actions for climate change, whether it's mitigation or adaptation or addressing loss and damage. And by extension, the different frameworks that govern them, which could be the Rio Conventions, as well as the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and also the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. From a UNDRR perspective, nature is central in the Sendai framework, which has the overall goal to prevent new and reduce existing disaster risk, which can be through, amongst other things, environmental measures that prevent and reduce hazard exposure and vulnerability, but also to reduce risk and loss of life, livelihoods, and environmental assets as one important expected outcome. To wrap up, nature is therefore not just for climate action, but considered more holistically, it reduces disaster risk and contributes to wider resilience and sustainable development goals.
Thank you so much, Leanne, for really breaking that down. And understanding nature-based solutions is one thing, but then making them work on the ground is another. And for this next segment, I would actually go to Simone. Simone, from your perspective, what do you think are the key capacity gaps and needs when it comes to advancing nature-based solutions, or sort of keeping it short? So what's holding us really from putting these solutions into practice?
After that very excellent introduction from Leanne, we know already, and then she stressed it, that we do know that nature-based solutions actually do have a proven benefit for reducing climate impacts, helping us adapt to climate change, but also to reduce disaster risk. So, as you rightfully said, why don't we yet see the implementation perhaps at the scale needed? So, on the one hand, I believe we might still face some lack of knowledge about the exact solutions for the right place. So, for example, all three of us are based in Bonn in Germany, which obviously is a moderate climate. We do face some flood risk, but other places in the world might face very different risks from climate extremes. But at the same time, the ecosystems are also very different. So what might work here might not work elsewhere. So compared to the more, let's say, old school or the more traditional engineered solutions, which would be we build a dam or a dike against a flood, we now need to really see what species do we plant, how long do they need to grow, what's the protection level at a certain point in time. So it's a different type of knowledge that we need. But on the bright side, much of that knowledge has already accrued over time. So we do already have a wealth of knowledge. However, it's a lot. And it might also look a bit overwhelming to now reconsider traditional approaches by converting from the gray infrastructure to the nature-based solution or green infrastructure, or having a hybrid thereof. So that's certainly one capacity gap in there. At the same time, another crucial gap is also around the way to implement it. While it sounds very logical that we should perhaps shift from, one go-to solution that is always being named in the context of nature-based solutions is not thinking about engineered coastal defense, but going to replant or maintain mangrove along coastlines. But that, of course, also requires different skills in terms of plantation, maintenance, and that also takes sometimes more time. It would also require very different economic approaches and budgeting systems, which now it sounds very easy, but it ranges across election periods, for instance. So all of these tiny things then come together and force us into choosing a different approach. So that is one key gap, and then also need. At the same time, much has already happened, and Leanne already stressed that nature-based solutions would also be beneficial for different for all the Rio conventions, as well as for the Agenda 2030, which is very true. But if you come from a sectoral perspective, so for instance, I was trained as an urban planner. If I'm an urban planner, I might look into the future of that city. I might not necessarily look into communities downstream of a river, which is on a different scale or addresses different disciplines, which is at my forefront might not be the biodiversity. But if I do implement nature-based solutions, one of the key benefits, which is always stressed, is that they have multiple benefits or so-called co-benefits. So I do plant the mangrove for coastal protection, but at the same time, they might provide livelihoods for the local communities, which is not at the forefront of my interest there, but could benefit others. So they can also be a very excellent entry point for systemic approaches, thinking across sectoral boundaries and integrated approaches, which, however, also force us into partly overcoming siloed thinking and maybe investing slightly more into the initial planning before starting with the implementation processes. And that's why one last gap that I want to stress that I think all of us here are working actively on is how to overcome or how to enable this being addressed and implemented in policies. And when I say policies, that can range from risk reduction policies to climate action policies, but also to biodiversity, spatial planning, urban planning, and others. And I was, of course, here.
Thanks so much, Simone, for that really helpful overview. I think it's clear that ultimately for nature-based solutions to hold, they need to be supported by the right enabling environment. And you very well mentioned as well that while there are solutions out there, it's not really a one-size-fits-all approach, right? They need to be really particular to that context and to that particular discipline. I have a question for the two of you, again, on this solutions topic. You very heavily covered the gap, Simone, and maybe some solutions that are already emerging. So I'd love for you to dive a bit deeper into this as to what solutions are already out there to essentially close these gaps. But then also you mentioned the policy, but I'd love for you as well to tell us a little bit about where research or evidence is really out there that's guiding the better implementation of these nature-based solutions.
Happily so. And you will have to pause me here because it's definitely a topic close to my heart and close to the heart of many colleagues in UNU. So the good news is that over the last years, there's a growing body of evidence on the benefits of nature-based solutions. And for instance, there is research how much mangrove plantation can save in terms of losses avoided in climate disasters. So there is repositories and there are also scientific papers with UNU also steered a few ones over the last years on the actual benefits and solutions provided by different nature-based solutions. And I said earlier that this has to be ecosystem or context specific. So there's a variety of publications, including some co-authored with UNDRR on how to really implement nature-based solutions in the right way so that they provide the maximum of benefits. And the same is true for many scientific publications that, for instance, me coming from a background, have proven the benefit of vegetation for reducing urban heat islands or reducing urban flooding. And those are definitely go-to solutions. And what I'm particularly interested in personally is to also see the social perspective thereof, because I earlier mentioned co-benefits. Nature-based solutions can also be implemented on the very local scale. And over the last years, for instance, in UNU, we did research in some of our projects on how can this even be implemented in urban informal settlements or informal contexts where they can provide some help to, at the same time, contribute to healthy diets and food security while reducing, for instance, impacts from flooding or peak heat waves and urban heat islands. So that sense, that's gaps being addressed in research and also in research to policy. So with a perspective on the policy, I believe we do need to support policymakers from international to local level. And on the international level, as we're already in the run-up to COP30, what we already see is that over the last years, many countries have added nature-based solutions as a go-to approach in both risk reduction, but also in climate action plans. And we, for instance, over the last weeks did some background research on the newly written NDC 3.0s. And there is a number of countries where you can clearly see that they have added nature-based solutions for making their for acting on climate change. One example that comes to my mind, for instance, is Kenya, that very actively has put afforestation, reforestation, and even community forests at the forefront of their climate actions.
Leanne, anything to add from your side?
Thank you. Simone went so much into detail in some of what I would like to complement. Perhaps I could reflect on 4 different areas. One is on building the base, which is data. The research that Simone was talking about, for example, would have been based on data that would have been collected, data of all different kinds. And so there's already so much happening in having data as an important element of nature-based solutions and climate action. So as an example, it's also important to have the data and have it in a systematized way to be able to track losses and damages where we're able to identify the impact on nature and also how the impact on nature affects people when different hazardous events occur. And happy to report that UNDRR is supporting countries with tracking of these hazard events. And we also have now a system which we are calling Delta Resilience, which is building out on a previous system as Inventar to track how these events are affecting people, the impact on nature, but also broadly non-economic losses that are happening. Data is also important for risk assessment. So how do we know what will be affected in the manner that climate change is unfolding or projected to unfold? This is where risk assessments become very important. The second area is equipping to effect change. And when Simone mentioned policy, that's an important element of that. It's having the policies that are holistic, but also having the tools and the resources, such as the collaboration that UNDRR did with UNU-EHS to prepare that toolkit on nature-based solutions, and also having guidelines produced to assist with incorporating disaster risk reduction into national biodiversity strategies and action plans. It's also important for advocacy and also methodologies. The importance of methodologies is becoming even more important when we consider the impact on slow onset events, and those are some of the things that are also evolving. And again, there's partnerships happening to advance on methodologies to be able to collect and understand this kind of data and information, including one that's currently underway and a partnership between UNDRR, UNEP, and UNU-EHS to see how to better capture the impact of climate or other events on biodiversity and ecosystems. The third is delivering dynamic solutions. So it's tailoring interventions, building on the data, building on the risk assessments. And as Simone also mentioned, it's being very targeted to the specific locations or countries or communities, and being able to ensure that what is being put forward as nature-based solutions is appropriate. And the other element is learning from others. The peer-to-peer, the south-to-south, the north-to-south exchanges are also very critical. A lot of that is happening and certainly could benefit from being scaled up. And my final point on this is including everyone, being very inclusive. So we're giving agency to the voices of everyone, the indigenous communities, the local communities, those who operate at the national level, those across different sectors, and having this holistic view where we're involving all different actors at all different levels and ensuring that in designing the different solutions or processes that there's no disadvantageous activities, especially when it comes to vulnerable groups. So I would leave those 4 suggestions as things that are happening and certainly things that can benefit countries and communities when they're scaled up.
Well, thank you both so much for these wonderful insights. I've been taking so many notes on this side, and I think it's clear that the more we close these gaps, the more inclusive, evidence-based, and scalable these solutions become. Leanne, I loved how at the beginning of the episode you mentioned that life doesn't happen without nature. And both of you through this episode, you've very well proven that nature-based solutions, again, are not just about protecting, conserving, and restoring ecosystems, but the co-benefits and the multiplier effect that comes with this in terms of the human development side, right? And ultimately, nature-based solutions being about resilience, livelihoods, and well-being. So it's really been a dream having you both in the episode. I've learned so much personally, and I hope our listeners did as well. You mentioned as well, Leanne, a couple of toolkit and other resources. So for our listeners, we'll be including those in the description box below. We hope you enjoyed today's discussions. Thank you for tuning in, and don't miss our other CB Stories Climate Action 101 episodes. Thank you both again for joining us, and see you all in the next one.